With the 2024 NHL Trade Deadline just a month away, I decided to go through the entire NHL and rank the most interesting as well as the most likely guys that could be dealt at this year's deadline. But who could your team trade for or trade away? Well, make sure you watch till the end as we go through all the players here and all my rankings, and hit that subscribe button if you're new for more hockey and trade deadline content as we lead up to the deadline this year. But let's get started with today's ranking with the most likely player to be dealt at this year's deadline, and to me, it's pretty obvious. It's going to be Henrique of the Anaheim Ducks. Really, the only thing stopping Henrique from being dealt is his trade protection, which has a 10-team no-trade list. But even then, I think almost every single contender is going to be going after him. And I could even see a situation where Henrique maybe waives his no trade if he goes to the right team. This is a 34-year-old, and there's not really much for him to do in Anaheim at this point. He's having a really solid last couple of years. 38 points last year, and this season, 35 points in 50 games, 7 points over his last 5. The consistency, the work ethic with Henrique, it's always been there. And I think for contending teams looking for a third line, potentially third line center, Henrique is a pretty perfect choice. We will likely have to see some salary retention on this deal, but considering what Anaheim could get for Henrique, and with Lindholm and Monahan off the market, Henrique becomes one of the best assets available. Now we go on to one of the other players most likely to be dealt at the deadline this year, and that's Tanev of the Calgary Flames, who is probably one of the best defensemen available, especially in terms of pure defensive play. Tanev might be the best among everybody. Even at 34 years old, he is still a workhorse and still puts up amazing results. And with Calgary, he's still been playing well this year, 10 points in 49 games. And if you're in need of a defensive depth player who could play on your middle pair, potentially bring you some big value and some big minutes, Tanev is perfection. Really, the only thing that could hold back a Tanev deal from happening is that astronomical trade price that Calgary reportedly has for him. But honestly, even if he is just a rental, he's worth it if you need a defensive date. Next up, let's go on to the third player available and a long list of flyers that could be dealt this year's deadline. And next up, I have Scott Laughton, who has been kind of a recent addition to the trade block for Philly, but one of the better ones available. And even though this year offensively hasn't been his best by any means, 21 points in 53 games, this is still a player that can bring a lot of physical attributes as well as just great two-way play. And I think if he goes to a better team, rebounds, gets some more ice time as well, Laughton's going to be a very serviceable, great physical middle sixer. Now, Laughton would be more of a commitment, making $3 million for the next 2 seasons after this. So he's nowhere near a rental, but for a team looking to add some physical boost for not just this year, but the next few seasons, Laughton could be really interesting. It'll probably drive the cost up, him not just being a rental, but for Philly, he's a type of player that you could get a lot of value back. But next up, let's go to a Flyers center that is in a much different situation, and that's Morgan Frost at 24 years old as a former 27th overall pick. It's interesting because he had a great breakout year last year, 46 points in 81 games. This year, he started off pretty rough and has rebounded in a big way, but the lack of ice time has been a continual vocal point this year. And we've seen just some disgruntled attitude from Frost regarding his deployment with Philly this year, and it seems like we're very likely to see a resolution very soon. I can definitely see a situation where Philly ends up trading him at the deadline for maybe a different, younger forward. There's a lot of options here for Philly to explore, but Frost is likely to be dealt. Now going on to the defensive side with Sean Walker, who will be the last Flyer I talk about in today's episode, I promise. But in Walker's case, he is also a really interesting addition as a potential rental, making $2.6 million. He's had a great season with Philly up to this point, 19 points in 53 games. If you're looking for a mobile puck-moving D, Walker is very good in that aspect, great in transition and a good play driver as well. Not the greatest defensively, but he's not a slouch there either, and is pretty responsible for his size in his own end and pretty strong too. Walker could provide a lot of value if you're looking for somebody to play off the puck, get a little bit of transitional ability there, and work on maybe another defensive defenseman. But Walker could be interesting for a lot of teams looking for a little bit more juice on the back end. But next up, let's talk about the first goaltender on this list, and not the last. Well, I'll say that right now. But going next up, let's go on to the Calgary Flames and Jacob Markstrom. Now, we talked about Tanev before. Markstrom is going to be a really interesting player at this year's deadline. Considering his term and considering his age, it could be a really interesting bet. He's had a great season this year at Calgary, and in terms of goals saved above expected, is one of the best in the NHL this year. You wouldn't really see that from the save percentage, but this is a player that can still play great, and at 34 years old, is going to be one of the more interesting bets out there. But again, considering his cap hit at $6 million and the term with him having 2 more years left on this deal after this year, it's going to have to create a situation where a GM needs to be creative and really make something crazy happen to fit Markstrom in, because that $6 million is a pretty tough cookie, and for a lot of teams out there, it takes Markstrom out of their cards. But let's keep going through the Pacific Division, and next up to the Seattle Kraken, who, just like the Flames, have a lot of interesting trade options. The one that's really been floated around the most is Jordan Eberle, which for very good reason. As a rental at $5.5 million, he'll be pretty easy to trade besides his modified no trade clause, which is a 16 no trade list, which is the big thing there. But at 33 years old, he can still bring a lot on the scoring side, and even though he's kind of been slumping this year, only 9 goals in 47 games, this is a guy that could do some really big damage if he's on the right situation, on a bigger playoff contender, and a solid playmaker around him. I still think Eberle has a lot to give, even though he has been aging, but especially as a rental, he brings a lot of experience as well, and I think it'll be a pretty beautiful ad for a lot of teams out there. Now going on to another potential rental from the Seattle Kraken on the 4 group, and that's Alexander Wenberg, who as a maybe third-line defensive center could be an interesting addition. It's kind of fascinating to see because he's kind of just been an okay player for Seattle, and obviously just throughout his NHL career, he's just kind of been there. And I think as a defensive guy, he could be solid as a third-line center. I wouldn't really expect too much face-off-wise. He's never been above 49% in his entire NHL career. But this is still a guy that if you're, again, leaning on him defensively, could pitch him in the right moments, isn't going to be a game changer, but could be a really under-the-radar app. Now, Editor Grav is going to step in here for a minute and talk about the trade targets for Wenberg that I thought were interesting. He's kind of an under-the-radar piece of this year's deadline, and even though I'm not too high on him, still as a defensive third-line center, I think a lot of teams could be after him. We talked about the Rangers and needing a center as well. Wenberg, in more of a defensive style, could be pretty much perfect in that role, I think, and if the Rangers are actually going to want to trade for a third-line center, I think he could be good there. Maybe we see Wenberg return to the Florida Panthers, perhaps, if they're still looking for an upgrade on Anton Lundell as well. Maybe even the Colorado Avalanche, who, of course, have circled in on a bunch of different centermen throughout really the last year and a half since they've had major losses in that category. Maybe they go after another one. Wenberg could add some pretty good defense there. Next up, let's move on to number 9 and go back onto the defensive side of things to one of the more underrated D in the league and go on to another Alexander in Alexander Carrier, who with the Nashville Predators has been pretty great this season and really over the past couple of years has been pretty underrated as well in the Pred system. 30 points back in 2022 and it's just been solid since then. This year just as a good puck moving mobile D who is really smart, really collected, isn't going to overwhelm you physically. Obviously, with the size there, 5'11", 175, 4 pounds, you wouldn't expect that. But the smarts that he has is really solid in really all 3 zones. And I feel like if you just place him as your 4th defenseman, slot him right in, it'll be a pretty easy fit with Carrier. The way he's able to handle minutes and work off his teammates very well. This is going to be a really under-the-radar ad if somebody goes for him. And he's also rental too at $2.5 mil. Next up, let's go on to a much different defenseman here of the Montreal Canadiens, in fact, and that is David Savard, who I would say out of all the Montreal Canadiens potential targets is maybe the most likely to get dealt this year. Maybe Jake Allen gets dealt, but again, I think considering his term, maybe next year is a little more likely. But I think David Savard is a really interesting case. At 33 years old, I think the Habs could get actually some pretty good value back for him. And you can see this year, I mean, he's played games, he's been fine. Offensively, has had a couple of really interesting moments. But I think, honestly, he's a player that you might be expecting more defense from, but offensively, he's actually been pretty okay. And, of course, still brings a good physical balance to the game. I don't think he's going to be a major addition onto your defense or somebody that'll save your defense by any means. But if you put him on the bottom pair, I think there are worse options you can go for at this point. Now, even though he doesn't have any trade protection, he does make $3.5 million for this year and next. So, just like Allen, he wouldn't be a rental, but I don't know. I just feel like Savard is more likely to be dealt this year out of the 2. Next up, let's go on to number 11 and back to the winger side of things here, and an interesting name that comes around Pittsburgh. We've already talked about Jake Guentzel, and honestly, the more I think about it, the more I think that Pittsburgh just might end up holding on to him in the end. But one name that I think could be dealt from the Pens is actually Riley Smith, who they traded for this last offseason and had a pretty good start to the year, but kind of has trailed off recently. But this is a player that I still think in the right situation could do a lot of good. And according to Jesse Granger of The Athletic, who is reporting on the Golden Knights, saying that they could bolster their wing depth, there's been some speculation of him going back to the Vegas Golden Knights, which would be absolutely wild, and I would kind of like to see it, honestly. Smith is a versatile winger, though, that as just maybe a solid third-line power play scorer, I still think has a lot of punch to give, just hasn't really been the greatest fit with Pittsburgh so far. Next up, let's go on to the youngest player on this list, actually, in Philip Broberg of the Edmonton Oilers. If you're going to see the Oilers go after a big rental or some other major piece, you're probably going to see Philip Broberg going back in the trade. We've already seen Broberg have a lot of trade speculation with Edmonton after so much controversy of him getting sent down just earlier. Hey, he has played pretty well at 22 years old for Bakersfield. Nothing absolutely spectacular, but again, I still think there is value maybe as a bottom pair mobile D in the future. But but it just seems like Edmonton's stock with Broberg has completely fallen down the toilet, and they're probably very likely to trade him at this point. It just feels like they aren't really having much of a comfortable place for him in the future, and we'll likely see the guy dealt for some other bigger piece coming back. We've heard speculation of Edmonton going after Guentzel, perhaps. I would expect Broberg absolutely being a part of that deal. Now let's move on to one of the better shutdown players really available in this entire trade deadline, and that is Nick Dowd of the Washington Capitals, who is going to be one of these names that goes under the radar, but might end up getting a lot on trade deadline day. I don't know if a first-round pick like Frank Cervelli is reporting out there, but I can see a situation where he ends up getting a second-round pick when it's all said and done. Obviously, he's not going to be giving you much offense, but as a third-line shutdown center, there are so many other players you could go wrong for compared to Dowd. He is so good, especially this season defensively, really stepping up his game in a lot of ways. And he has been below 49% on the dot once in his career. You know what you're getting there. He's going to be a really solid defensive face-off centerman, and especially for a playoff team, is going to provide a lot of value in that category. Now, we'll see how much interest there is and how many teams expect there to be a fit, but Dowd is definitely going to have a lot of suitors come deadline day. But now let's go on to one of the biggest names available at the deadline this year at number 14. And next up, let's go on to Marc-Andre Fleury of the Minnesota Wild, who really has all the balls in his court at this year's deadline. Considering where Minnesota is kind of in the middle right now, we could see a player like Fleury moving on to a bigger contender. Now, I wouldn't expect him to be the starter wherever he goes, but as a potential backup option, even fringe starter, Fleury could be really interesting. At 39 years old, he's really been playing better as of late, getting back to a 900 save percentage. And again, I wouldn't expect him to save any team's goalie tandem, but again, as a character guy, as somebody you can rely upon if he comes right in for the playoffs, Fleury could be a really interesting ad. Probably wouldn't cost that much either, but he has a full no-move clause, so he would have to accept wherever he ends up going, and that is the big thing here. And we all want to see Fleury get another chance at the Stanley Cup, and even though Minnesota has been looking better, let's be honest, it's probably not going to be with many if he ends up getting another. Now, there are guys I didn't mention in today's video that will likely be dealt, like Frank Vatrano. You got Nick Seeler as pretty much an automatic lock. You could have Jake Allen potentially in there, maybe a Joel Edmondson perhaps, a Capo Kakinen, Anthony Duclair, almost every single friggin' San Jose Shark. But I'm not going to wait any longer because we're going to get into number 15 here, and the biggest wild card of this year's deadline by far, even though his team has been playing a lot better as of late, we've started to hear Pavel Buchnevich's name a lot in trade rumors recently. Now, it would be fascinating if we saw Buchnevich made available, and it seems like we might be seeing that with St. Louis. He has had an incredible last few years when he's been healthy with the Blues and would immediately become the best player available by far. I mean, if Jake Guentzel is going to be dealt, Buchnevich would be easily the number one. As a great power winger, this would be a fascinating addition. I mean, for the New York Rangers, I'm just saying they need a right winger. It would be pretty awesome to see that. Now, the thing with Buchnevich is he makes $5.8 million and becomes a UFA after next season. And the word is that St. Louis doesn't really want to give him this huge extension, likely at around $8 million that Buchnevich would be seeking. And there's been word, especially from Frank Cervelli, talking about Buchnevich as a potential trade piece, and it would be an incredible player if anybody's able to get him. St. Louis is trending in a pretty great way the past few weeks, but they've also in the past traded guys at the deadline, even if they have been in playoff positions. So they're not afraid to make a deal, and I think with Buchnevich especially, this is a guy that could get a massive haul, a first, a top prospect, a good player. I mean, Buchnevich is just that good. You can see just how solid he's been over the past few years, around a point-per-game player, if not better than that, and that's what I see him being on an even better team than St. Louis. He's going to be a monster, has been one, and if a team gets him for the next 2 years, I mean, that would be one heck of a deal. Even if a team doesn't want to sign him afterwards, you get a year and a half of Buchnevich, and that's a year and a half of Buchnevich, which is still pretty good. But let me know in the comments down below, do you guys think a Buchnevich trade can happen? And where do you see all these different names ending up on deadline day? Let us know all your thoughts down below. Of course, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell if you guys haven't already. And share the video with all the hockey fans you guys know online. Leave this card as well for my trade content right on playlist. And I will see you in the next one. Have a great hockey day, and goodbye.